for me, it's about like trying to take a wider view and say, can we examine how these us versus them narratives and emotions really bias us and get us to, in the same way we were talking about for two pessimistic framings, it's like we're too likely to say like, I don't like what happened. I don't trust the other side. Therefore, I'm going to say the election was rigged.
Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am delighted to be joined by Zachary Elwood, author of Diffusing American Anger and host of a podcast where they often discuss political polarization and politics generally. Zach, welcome to the show.
Hey Josh, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, not a problem, man. So I had a read through your book and lots of very interesting topics. Nice hot button things, which is great. But I guess the place to start would be polarization generally. So, like, it feels to me, at least, just from my own assessment of things, that things continue to get increasingly polarized. But that I feel often is very much based on what I see online. And I often wonder, how real is that? Because, for example, I was just down at the March to Rejoin the EU that was in London a couple of days ago. I went down, filmed some interviews with people on the street and asked them why they were there, and expected to get like the sort of people that you get on Twitter at these events. And it turned out that everyone was very lovely and very reasonable, and not in the slightest way the crazy ranting lunatics that you'll find on Twitter. So, like, how real is the polarization in broad society that people are seeing online?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to talk about because, and you can find people doing all sorts of research trying to really define what polarization means and how big a problem is it. And, for example, you can separate it into the dimension of the actual polarization of beliefs, like what policies we actually want. You can separate it into, how much contempt each side has for the other side. So, when people talk about the problem of polarization, most people are talking about the large amount of contempt that people have. But, then as you say, there's the nuance of like how many people actually have that contempt, which is like, part of solving the problem too, is getting people to see how the other side is not this monster they imagine, and these kinds of things, and showing them that even the people who have a lot of animosity, they overestimate the degree to which the other side has animosity for them, the number of people and the degree of animosity. So all these things are really nuanced as you're drawing attention to. But I think there is the problem of a larger and larger percentage of people having more and more contempt for the quote other side, even as we also recognize the nuance in like the two sides not being a monolith, and it being simplistic to talk about there even being two sides. But when you look at like studies of in America, the congressional polarization of like how likely the representatives are to agree on something, that gets worse and worse over the last few decades. And then like surveys of how much contempt and animosity average citizens have for the quote other side and such, you can see those getting worse over decades, which is the kind of definition of what the problem is. It's not that we disagree on things, it's that we have animosity and contempt for people who disagree with us more and more, and we see even things that we wouldn't have seen as moral, representing moral incorrectness or badness. We start to see more and more stances on issues kind of wrapped up into this, like, oh, you're a bad person for having this stance or voting for this candidate or such. Yeah, so that's kind of how I see it as defining the problem. But it is a really hard thing to talk about because even talking about like I'm doing depolarization work, people will think like, oh, you're trying to shift my stances on things, where it's like, no, we're trying to examine like exaggerated, outsized anger and animosity and contempt for the other side, and like, is that misplaced, and does that make sense, and does that make things worse? These kinds of things.
How much do you think social media is to blame for this like animosity that people seem to have towards the other
Yeah,
side?
I think it's a great question. I mean, it's something I've delved into. One of the early political pieces I wrote was I spent a few weeks researching it and writing about kind of the inherent ways that the internet, I think, leads to uh, more divisive framings. Like, for example, one is like we're all distant from each other and we behave in worse ways when we're distant. We use more dehumanizing language. We're more likely to just like say what is ever on our mind, where we wouldn't do that in person. These kinds of things. And then you factor in to there's also the thing that I examined in my piece was, there's research that shows when you write something down, especially publicly, you're more likely to protect that point of view and less likely to change your mind. So it could be that the inherent aspect of like us writing things down, which is a completely new thing in human history, right? Like that's a very recent thing. We're all writing things down on social media, and then we feel the need to defend it. We feel the need to be self-consistent, and so that could be an inherent way that's kind of deranging us. So I personally think, based on my research and the people I've had on my podcast, some of which are like well-known researchers on social media and polarization, and like some of them would agree with me, and I write about this in my book. It's like I do think that social media is a amplifying force on polarization. You've also got the fact that the internet inherently creates a place that's easy for us to find insults to our group, and one way polarization grows is we perceive more and more insults and threats to our group, and the internet creates an environment where anybody can highlight anything else anybody has said and say, hey, look at what they're saying about you, you should be threatened, you should be angry. So it just creates a breeding ground for insult and grievance. And it lets us always remember these things, whereas like without the internet we might be more likely to forget some of these offenses. So all of these offenses are at a moment's reach. We can dredge them up and say, hey, look, remember all these horrible things that they did to you. So I think I do see it as an amplifying force.
That's interesting that the previous crimes or the things you said 15 years ago can be
right.
It's just like, maybe this person seems really reasonable now, but look at what he said this one time like 20 years ago, or look at this one article about this thing that I disagree with.
Well, yeah, imagine in Rwanda, like, imagine what they went through with more social media. You'd be like, hey, these people killed your family, like you never forget that. Well, you always keep bringing that up over and over, right? And it's like, how can you heal when you keep bringing up the grievances and amplifying the grievances?
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that as something that should be considered in this discussion. Well, yeah, that's.
Forgiveness becomes harder, basically.
Yeah, 100%. And honestly, like I'm 100% like I've been a victim of this kind of thinking because I see it all the time. Like, things that I'd forgotten. My cat's meowing. Well, it's not even my cat, but the cat. I don't know if it's coming. I can hear it on the mic.
I can't hear it.
Okay, that's all right then. I'll let him in. Maybe he'll come in a minute. Anyway, like I've definitely been a victim to that. Like literally today, because there was I don't know if you're familiar with this story. Our health secretary throughout the first sort of year and a half of the pandemic was this guy called Matt Hancock. Okay. And then whilst he was in government laying out all the rules and restrictions that we were supposed to be following, he was having an affair in the office whilst like he was on TV, like saying, you shouldn't meet new sexual partners, like don't go out dating, don't do anything, whilst he's having an affair in the office, right, with some like outside consultant, and then he stood down in disgrace, obviously, or well, not obviously these days, but thankfully, and then he went on whilst still a sitting MP. So whilst he was still like the equivalent would be like, so you'd been like, I don't know, you'd been in the Senate leadership or the House leadership, and then you'd stood down in disgrace, but you were still a member of Congress. And then he went on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, while still representing the constituents that had elected him, he was still getting paid as an MP, and he was getting. Anyway, every single time I talk
Hmm.
about it, I can feel the temperature of my blood rising. And I
Hmm.
saw an
Hmm.
interview with him today, and I'd forgotten about it. And I was just, well, not forgotten, but you know what I mean? It sort of like swung, it was like only in the back of my mind. It wasn't like the forefront. I remember that. I was like, oh, these
Hmm. Hmm.
crooks. Like, I was so
Yeah.
angry again because of it. It's, yeah, amazing how that, um, and I'm reading this interesting book that actually sort of brings up a lot of principles. It's called The Gutenberg Parenthesis. I'm interviewing this guy, Jeff Jarvis,
Mm.
in a couple of weeks. Um, and he talks about how the complaint of people in print was that like sometimes that things were all going to be codified now and things would never be forgotten because they were written down. And it's funny to see like this is like the greater evolution of it, because now it's not only on hand to us, it's like three three keystrokes away. You search it and you'll find the thing that you want to make you angry.
Yeah, that is. I mean, to your the story you were talking about. I mean, I think when it comes to how conflicts grow and polarization, us versus them, polarization grows. We people often focus on like misinformation or distorted information, whereas like a big factor is actually real things and how we filter for those things, right? Like, for example, you not to say that you're unfairly filtering things, but like if you were filtering for the things that most likely bothered you and that added to your us versus them anger, you're going to pick those out, and just like somebody on the other side will have their things about like people they dislike, politicians, leaders they dislike. They'll be like, look at these things that they're doing that are so horrible, and we're going to focus on those things, mostly. And I think that's an important point, because we focus so much on like untrue things, and how there's this I think too much focus on like misinformation, whereas I think a lot of it is just like how we filter for the world, which just comes down to like our biases. And it's even not to say that we're not right, because we can be fairly rationally made upset by things, right? Like you being made upset by hypocrisy that you perceive by people. But it's like it's how we add all those things together and like use them to kind of like theoretically justify our contempt for the quote other side, and like seeing all the bad things on the other side, and not seeing how our group, people on our side, may be adding to the in similar ways to the conflict. So I think that's what I try to bring attention to, is trying to get people, even if they think the other side is worse, to examine the dynamics and say, hey, is there something I can do to like lessen the contempt, basically? Yeah.
Mm. So, oh, Max has joined us. Um,
Oh yeah. Is that you said that wasn't your cat?
no, it's my flatmate's cat.
Ah, I gotcha. Yeah, yeah. Bring him
Um,
into the conversation.
yeah, I mean he's uh, normally only vocal about sort of food issues, which makes me think he's a humanitarian. Um, so the thing that really I think broke people's brain, especially in America, in terms of polarization, was the candidacy of Donald Trump. And I think he and Joe Biden actually right now exemplify the perfect, they're a perfect case study in the exact thing that you were talking about here. You're just like they've both got examples of egregious corruption, which have been ignored by one side or the other based on who they find to be the more appealing candidate. But like, what do you think about it was about Trump that caused such? It was so divisive in terms of like people's attitude towards him or in support of him.
Yeah, I have a section in the book, not surprisingly, on Trump himself and our perceptions of him, and our kind of divergent perceptions. And I actually just made an excerpt of this available on my site, because it kept coming up. I kept seeing, even to this day, some liberal people will say, how could Trump voters, uh, support Trump when Trump did X thing, like called Mexican rapists or whatever. And so I delve into the nuance of that to show there can be very different views of all of those anecdotes that are dredged up, right? It's like, for example, I mean, like I have an example in my book where, a quote from a Mexican American Trump voter who says like clearly Trump was not talking about all Mexicans. He was just talking about a criminal element getting across the border. So this is just to say some of the ways that we filter for our things that match our us versus them animosity can be very biased, can add to the conflict. For example, one of the things I try to draw attention to for liberals, like even if you very much dislike Trump, because I find Trump a bad and divisive person. He likes to divide people, and I don't like to divide people. So even if you think that about Trump, you can examine how your biased and overreactions, hysterical overreactions, and worst case framings about him actually help him, because you're basically creating the anger. You're creating the us versus the anger that you say you do not like, and I try to make people see how there were a lot of like very bad. There was a lot of bad reporting. Glenn Greenwald drew attention to a lot of bad Trump Russia reporting, which was a very good examination. And I think liberals. I try to help people see the contributions of people in their own group, right? So it's like, can you acknowledge that there was a lot of bad, unreasonable, irresponsible coverage and framings of Trump, even if you still very much dislike Trump? Like, I feel like the nature of polarization is like everybody wants to be like, you're either with us or against us, but it's like you can have nuanced views and examine how these things amplify our divides and make things worse, no matter what your beliefs are, right? It's like, I think that's the thing, because I talk to Trump voters, and some of them are like, yeah, I think Trump has like thrown gasoline on the fire, even though I'm a supporter of his, right? There's nuanced views even on across the board. So I think it's, if we care about reducing the contempt we have for each other, we should be willing to like aim for the nuance and aim for how our divides grow, examine the roots of our divides, things like this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was just obviously. I personally think he's hilarious, but shouldn't be president.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that's what a lot of people, yeah, there's a lot of nuanced views. I think that's the thing. It's like, even for people that will vote for him, they'd be like, I don't like this and this, but I'm not willing to listen to what the liberal leaning media and politicians say about him, because they've been very unfair to him in the past. So it's like, I think that's what I try to get across to a liberal audience is like, hey, there's some rational reasons why people don't listen to the liberal leaning media or don't trust them, and if we're going to get better as a society, we need to examine those things and acknowledge that there can be rational and understandable reasons for why people do the things they do, or even if we very much disagree with them, right?
Like, to what extent do you think the media are responsible for some of the polarization?
Yeah, I think it's a big impact. You've probably heard of Matt Taibbi's book about, what was it?
Hate Inc.
Hate Incorporated.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah, Hate Inc. Yeah. He I think he does a good examination of some of the dynamics. The thing I try to do in my work too is like, even if we think the media, because I think there's a lot of like kind of like paranoid thinking about like what the media is doing, where to me it's like an understandable phenomenon, because Matt Taibbi talks about this. It's like when Trump came to power, he was such a polarizing presence. It resulted in a lot of journalists kind of like overreacting in various ways, and it wasn't due to any like big plot. It was just like many people were understandably kind of overreacted to him and were scared of him, and like I'm worried about him. But it all it resulted in a lot of bad journalism, basically, and in the same way it resulted in a lot of people saying a lot of irresponsible things, like saying Trump wasn't a legitimate president, which I talk about in my book. But all these things are kind of like fundamental aspects of conflict, right? It's like these things are not due to some malicious plot, whereas I think people are a little bit too quick to reach for that on both sides. Like liberals will be like, there's a big plot going on by the conservatives, and conservatives will say there's some big plot going on by the liberals. But I think what we need to realize is like all of these things that people are doing are kind of like human responses to conflict, right? It's like we tend to like filter too much for things that we view as grievances and offenses, and we focus too much on them, and that leads us to overreact in various ways. And institutions and journalists can be can be subject to the same human forces. It's not like could be immune from these human forces, right? So I try to get it back to, and I interviewed somebody who wrote a whole book on that, and her name of her book was Media Is Us, and it was about how like we often talk about the media as being some separate thing, and it's like, no, it's just a bunch of humans, right? It's like that all these things that we criticize in the media are things we do in our own minds. They're just like on a broader scale, right? They're having to do with media. But so I try to, I think it's also anger reducing to say, hey, we can criticize these people for doing things that we think are wrong, while also being like, hey, also are just humans, and if we try to appeal to that aspect of them and say, hey, you should do a better job, because of these criticisms we have, I think we're more likely to see people, self-examine more across the board, whether in like academia or journalism or whatever.
So it seems like you're making quite a quite a big case for like personal responsibility in dealing with the polarized society.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, one of the arguments I make in my book is that we all need to be more aware. I think if we're going to grow as a culture, and kind of be healthier as a culture, I think it takes more people being aware of how they contribute to our divides. And I think part of that is like even just educating people about the nature of conflict, because I feel like that's kind of what motivates my work, is a frustration with journalists and politicians who, the things that we're dealing with are just like things that many other countries have dealt with. Even most countries now in the world, just with different issues sometimes. But the nature of conflict is remarkably consistent no matter what issues are being dealt with. It's some of these fundamental forces, and I think if we talked about that more, like if you had more politicians talking about, hey, we're dealing with a very hard thing now that has affected many other countries. And I actually wrote a script, a speech I would like to see, an imaginary speech I would love to see Biden or somebody make that was kind of like addressing these things head on and saying, hey, look, we're dealing with hard things. A lot of people hate me. A lot of people are angry, et cetera, and kind of address these things head on. I'm just frustrated that more politicians and more journalists don't, and more pundits don't talk about those things. But the nature of conflict is that few people want to talk about the nature of conflict, because even talking about conflict from a high level is perceived as like offending your group, right? Because it's implying that the fault is not with the other side. The fault is like this human group dynamic thing, and that can even be perceived as like offending one's own group. So that's the interesting thing, is like conflict fundamentally creates an environment where one can't, many people are not incentivized, or they're scared of talking about the nature of conflict, which is part of the problem. I think we can't get above the problem, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time what I think both sides are very guilty of what you said, of being almost offended by opinions that counter what they want to hear from people that they support, whether that's politicians or journalists or just like social media personalities, YouTubers, you name it. And I think the right has this idea that the left are so much more easily offended. But say a right wing, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Well, the oversensitivity to criticisms of Trump, I think, is a good example. It's like Trump is shouldn't Trump as a leader be able to be criticized? But for some people, there's so much emotion wrapped up into it. Like even a very objective or even well-meaning criticism can be met with like, you're our enemy now by saying that. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, you just want the communists to win. Like,
Right. You're either with us or against us. You need to get fully on board our thing, which is, like you said, which is what both groups do in a conflict, even if we may think, we all have our thoughts about which groups are worse in that regard. But I think seeing that aspect of like how conflict naturally makes many of us be like, you're either with us or against us, right?
and then sort of on the other side of that, I think a lot of people with a platform underestimate the ability of an audience to be nuanced. So like they'll sort of have an opinion that maybe is counter to what the majority of their audience would think, right? And I think people are often happy to hear a different opinion expressed as long as it's like thought out and well argued and like reasonable, and that people can get caught up in, they see some loud angry voices on Twitter and think that the entire group of their audience is attacking them, and then they sort of become more defensive and sort of more conservative in what they're willing to say, you know?
No, totally. I think that's right, and kind of gets back to your initial question of like we can have an exaggerated view of how many people are actually angry at us, or it's like in social media especially, comments we get can give an outsized exaggerated vision of like how many people are angry at us. Like it doesn't take many angry voices to really shut people down, right? We've seen that a lot of times. And I think when I wrap up my book at the end, I talk about if we care about reducing contempt, reducing us versus them polarization, more of us need to be a little bit braver and recognize that just because you're getting angry voices, at you doesn't mean that those voices doesn't mean you should bow to those voices, because that's how polarization gets worse, right? It's like more people kind of shutting down their attempt at nuance or their attempts at like pushing back on divisive framings. To get better, we need more people kind of saying, no, I don't think these people on my side are correct. They're being, a bit extreme, but, for various understandable reasons, few people are willing to do that. They either fear losing their influence, so they shut down and go with the flow, or they're genuinely afraid of, the exhausting nature of, arguing with people online. But I think to your point, it's like I do think if more people need to recognize that the bulk of people do want, are capable of more nuance and do think that there are extreme divisive ideas on both sides, and I think the more people try to speak to that audience, it's not only, it's not only depolarizing or anger reducing. I think it's also just more persuasive when we like aim our arguments at like the people more in the middle, but so many people want to focus on like the extremes and be like, look at what these people are doing. And it's like, maybe if we just talked more to the people, the bulk of people, I feel, who are, a bit more nuanced in their thinking and just less angry in general, we'd see more, we'd see more coming together, because we'd be speaking more to this bulk of people and persuading, even for political activist kind of purposes. I think you're just like persuading more people. It's just a more effective thing. So I see the anger reduction as kind of like aligned with actual political effectiveness, because I see extreme divides as being kind of like lose for everybody. It just becomes this like seesaw where, where eventually things get out of control even and become violent or unstable. But even before that, you've just got this like seesaw effect where like somebody's taking power and then they take it back and make changes, or then the next group comes in and does something different. It becomes this unstable, lose scenario for everyone. So I think, even for politically passionate people, I think like taking these conflict resolution approaches is just like the way you actually convince people and make the case for your activism or your goals or whatever.
Like one of the things I wanted to ask you about actually is um I'm gonna use UK based examples just because that's the thing that I sort of witness more than the US, but like the general thing applies broadly. Like you could take this and like put it onto like a lot of American examples. I think you'll get my point. It's like um recently, about 6 months ago, a year ago, I don't know exactly how long. So the UK law, like the UK had a new news channel called GB News, right? Which is basically, I think they're aiming to try and be the Fox for the UK almost, right?
Mm.
They have had some good discussions on there, a lot of like varied opinions, and they've talked about some stuff that like wouldn't get discussed on other mainstream channels, like on both sides of the aisle, and just like addressing issues that sort of don't get discussed. So it's almost more of like a talk show news channel, which is pretty much the Fox sort of, but also sort of the CNN model in a lot of ways, and a lot of these news channels seem to go that way, where it's like an opinion piece with
Mm-hmm.
like discussion about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw so many people sort of screeching about it and being like, "Oh, they'll fail. It'll be awful. They'll die. You know, it's not going to last." There was a campaign to get advertisers to pull the ads from them and like to try and ruin them financially, and that didn't work. Um, and now, sort of, I think last week it was the 19th of September. They outperformed the BBC and Sky News, who are two like other large news channels, in terms of average viewership across the day. They were better than them. And the only reactions I saw from anyone who would have considered themselves to be, like, oh, the BBC are great, this is the mainstream, this is the norm, the accepted, and they just screeched about how could people do this? What on earth is going on? Well, it's all the racists watching. It's all the misogynists and the awful people, and this happens in so many issues, left and right. And it's not just the left that scream these sorts of things about things they don't believe, but they seem to be very loud generally about things. But because I think they occupied the mainstream of like news and media in a lot of places, and none of them ever go, why are they getting the views and we're not? They never ever sort of like self-reflect and look internally and go, what is it about that channel that is meaning people are tuning in more than ours? They just like write them off as awful people. So like, why do you think it is that happens? That there's never a self-reflection about why people are tuning into something different, or why people are supporting something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets to that. I think there's a few things there. I mean, one of the things I read about in my book, is the kind of the asymmetry between the groups. For example, you mentioned a part of that is that the liberal leaning beliefs and people dominate cultural institutions, in academia or news or entertainment. And I think so there's this real sense, understandable sense, that conservatives have, that they're the underdogs fighting this huge institution, this empire. So I think that kind of helps explain some of the more belligerent approaches on, for why example, even conservatives would, many conservatives would acknowledge like there's not a direct correlation or equivalent of like somebody like Trump on the left, but they would say that's because Trump is fighting a powerful ingrained institution of, and that, so we need somebody that's willing to like be aggressive, right? That's what they would say. So I think examining the kind of like uneven power dynamics can help us understand, why, for example, conservatives in America or Britain feel the need, like we need our own news station because we aren't getting our ideas out there, and that's why we're frustrated. That's why we're angry, right? We don't have to, liberals don't have to agree with that, but seeing that's why people feel that way, right? Like it can start to make more sense. That's how I see as like kind of like a fundamental dynamic thing. But then, to your question of why do people reach for like the least charitable or most pessimistic views of what motivates, why is this channel successful? I mean, I think it gets back to the very pessimistic views we have. We have these very distorted opinions of what drives the other side's beliefs. So, regardless of if we're right or wrong about how their channel does, if they succeed, then it must just because, it must be because there's even more horrible people than we imagined, right? It's like, it can't be because, we don't want it. We have an inclination to not examine the reasons why they believe what they do or why people are watching that content. And there is one thing it reminds me of, I had this conversation with a liberal person, and I said something like, well, did you know, a significant number of Obama voters, later voted for Trump. There's a decent overlap. And this kind of like, I was making the case for why our perceptions are often very, very distorted, and there's a lot more nuance there than we thought. So I was talking about the significant number of racial minority Trump voters, and
Mhm.
the past Obama voters who voted for Trump. And one thing they said, they were like, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That is surprising." But that just goes to show you how misogynistic Trump voters are, that they wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. So it's like they but I think it shows how we take our very pessimistic views of the other side, and we just, if we learn something that contradicts it, we'll just immediately pivot to something else that corresponds with our pessimistic views, right? So it's like we're able to correct a little bit, but we still just reach for another super pessimistic view of what motivates them, right? So it's like, oh, maybe they weren't as racist as I thought, but they must hate women. They all must hate women, even if they're racial minorities, right? So I think it just helps explain the way that we reach for these very distorted, least generous views. Whereas, and part of that is like many of us just don't interact with people who are politically different from us. Like if some of these people had more friends on the other side, on the left and right, for the most angry people, they would start to see the more generous, understandable reasons for why they believed what they believed. But because we're often so like segregated in our own worlds these days, we just have this like very stereotypical, simplistic view of like how horrible these people are.
Yeah, I mean that's it. Just reminds me of like there's a guy I'm quite a big fan of. His name is Adam Coleman, or Adam B. Coleman.
Oh yeah.
You know some of his work, yeah.
Yeah, I think I follow him on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a really lovely guy. I've had him on the show quite a few times, and then he came to London, and we had him in person, which was really fun. And he sort of points out sometimes when people see him expressing like what would be considered racist opinions, if it was like said by a white commentator, then it's the response is never like, maybe it's not racism. The response is always like, well, that's how deep the white supremacy goes. And it's like, come on, man.
Yeah, that is a good example. It's reaching for the most pessimistic interpretation, even when you learn something. And I had this with my book where I showed it to a friend read Diffusing American Anger, and in that book I highlight some Black conservative points of view, and I do that for the same reason some conservatives highlight racial minority people and beliefs on their side, and in their mind it's to show that there can be nuance there, and to try to speak the language of liberals, because liberals often say we care what we want to hear the perspectives of racial minorities, Black people. And so conservatives sometimes are trying to speak that language and say, look, can you see how there can be nuance, and a Black person can have very different views on this topic. But the most pessimistic interpretation of that, when conservatives attempt that, liberals will say, oh, you're just using a token person who believes this, or you're trying to manipulate us by bringing this person forward as a representation. But it's like, that's like the least generous interpretation. Another interpretation is like, they're trying to show you that there can be nuance. That's a more generous interpretation than saying, implying that they're doing it for like manipulative reasons, or using a token minority. It's like there's all these ways that we filter for the least charitable interpretation of people's behaviors. And my friend did that for my book a bit. He was like, well, why would you use these people's points of view? It's like a token thing. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to show you that if you can understand how a Black person, for example, was able to vote for Trump, then maybe you'd be a little bit more charitable to the white people that voted for Trump, and see that it's not just about racism, or it's not just about the immediate things that may come to mind for us, or So I think it's getting back to your point. It's like we really are. Many of us are really prone to, we're going to take the worst possible interpretation of what you said or did, and spin it through that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you probably find. I also last week I had in the podcast this guy, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who wrote a book called "What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities." And in terms of the Brexit vote, he was pointing out that there was a lot of sort of majority minority areas that voted for Brexit, and a lot of them in sort of Islamic or Hindu communities are like very socially conservative in a lot of their
Hmm.
views. That they're maybe not even though they have immigrated to the emigrated to Britain, that they're not big fans of like high levels of immigration, or they value the family very highly, or they can be quite patriotic. In fact, one of the stats that he blew me away with was that if you just take a split of Britain down the middle in terms of like white versus non-white in terms of demographic, obviously it's quite simplistic, but like just for the purposes of illustration, he was like, look, the percentage of people who are white consider their British identity to something to be proud of is 63%. And amongst non-white people, it's 68%. So that he was really throwing like spanners in the works of this, and I find it fascinating to read his book and talk to him about, because it really like sort of addresses a lot of the misconceptions that people have about different sort of groups of people, and stereotypes that like we
Hmm.
all build up in our head. Like I was like blown away from it, and I try to
Hmm.
avoid being like jumping to conclusions about what people are gonna think.
Hmm.
So the last thing that I kind of wanted to get into was the part of the book that I find most interesting, and I think you'll have a lot of good things to say about this, is the denying elections from left and right, or basically denying the legitimacy of elections from the left and from the right.
Hmm.
So obviously, the 2016 through 2020 saw the Trump Russia investigations with Robert Mueller, who was the guy who prosecuted, who did the Enron case, as far as I'm aware, and a crack team of lawyers. And after several years, they found basically like very little evidence that there was anything there. And after the left spending a long time saying that Trump was not a legitimate president, they then in 2020, when the election rolled around and some conservatives, or well, a lot of conservatives, had questions about whether it was a legitimate election, um, called them election deniers and said that they were, destroying the fabric of the country. Um, and a lot of people on left and right, depending on the election year and who won, have argued about the integrity of U.S. elections, specifically relating to voting machines and like how vulnerable they are. Like there's
Hmm.
hackathons where people yeah, they prove they can crack into it in a matter of minutes. They're running on the tech that they upgraded after the Bush Gore like debacle in 2000, and they haven't like done any upgrades since. And I looked at the 2021 and I was like, well, I don't know what happened, right? Some weird stuff, but I don't know, right? Like, do you know what I'd love? I'd love a big investigation. And then after that, you spend as much money as you possibly can to ensure that there is no questions about the next election. None. And yet nothing like that happened, and I'm sure people like had the same queries. I don't know specifically, but in 2016, in 2000, I mean, you can go, I'm sure there's loads and loads of examples. And why do you think this has occurred, and why do you think people are so blinded by their side in terms of like questioning elections?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most important sections in the book and the hardest one to write because I mean I really did want to make a case of whether you're whatever your political beliefs are, examining how your us versus them animosity can bias you, and to examine. I mean, I think it's important to examine that making a claim that an election was illegitimate is a very serious claim, like theoretically a country destroying claim, and and I think not enough people take that seriously because you just see people willing to confidently say an election was rigged with very little evidence. And I've talked to people, I've talked to conservatives because I was curious to research that on my own, and I've seen people say things like, "Oh, I'm certain it was rigged," and I was like, "Well, what really, what's the main evidence you would point to?" And it just seemed really lacking. And I'm like, you see why, just as you would not like liberals to do these things, maybe it's bad to confidently say that you're certain an election was rigged when you don't really seem to be able to point too much that you're confident in it. But I think, I try to make the case, and it gets me grief, for all this stuff. It gets me grief and criticisms from both sides, because what I'm trying to say is examine the underlying reasons for how conflict naturally makes us distrust elections. And I spent a good amount of time on the liberal side, calling the 2016 election illegitimate, because and I examined my reasons for why I think that is such a bad and wrong claim and dangerous claim, because I think I do that for a few reasons. I think both sides need to examine the unreasonable aspects of what they're doing there. And I talked to a lot of liberals who kind of just don't even see the equivalence. They're like, well, there was, Russia tried to, tried to manipulate the election. And I'm like, well, there's studies that show that it was like a drop in the bucket. So like, even it's not even clear that I don't believe, and many other people do not believe, that they actually succeeded in changing it. But let's even suppose that they did. Like, let's even say, even worst case scenario, calling an election illegitimate because an enemy of the United States attempted to manipulate it is just like a fundamentally losing, like, game theory bad thing to do, because it basically rewards anybody for trying to manipulate your election. So, and I actually think that the reason Russia did what they did is just to create more distrust in elections, right? It's like you would have to actually do so much more to actually feel like you've actually, changed an election. But I think that the main thing that they got out of it was, like, many people calling an election illegitimate. Like, that is a destabilizing force, much more than like thinking you could actually shift an election, right? So I think, if you're going to say, like, hey, some foreign groups are spreading information we think is wrong, that's a reason to call an election illegitimate. Like, there's all sorts of misinformation and bad information all over the place. Like, we had domestic people making bad information. We had, you could make the argument that a lot of the mainstream coverage is wrong, and that's what the conservatives see. You can make an argument that, like, these Macedonian people that were motivated by financial incentives were producing a lot of fake news to get clicks and get income. Like, there's all sorts of ways we could say our election was tainted by bad information. Like, it's always been that way. Go back the history of the United States or any country, it's full of stuff that we could say is bad information. If you're going to use that to call an election illegitimate, like, you'll never be able to call another election legitimate, because you'll be like, hey, look at this bad information and how it could have shifted the election. It's just like a fundamentally losing proposition to take that stance, right? So I think, and that kind of overlaps with the some of the conservative, Trump voter views, because it's like they would say, like, well, the media did this and this and this, and that's why I'm going to call the election illegitimate. It's like the media is always doing stuff that people will disagree with. Like, they're doing bad journalism, or they're doing, the social media platforms are doing something we don't agree with. And, if you could reverse the tables and imagine a conservative dominant society doing some similar things, and some liberals using that to say, oh, the election was illegitimate because I disagreed with what the media and was doing in this regard. So I think, for me, it's about, like, trying to take a wider view and say, can we examine how these us versus them narratives and emotions really bias us and get us to, in the same way we were talking about for two pessimistic framings, it's like we're too likely to say, like, I don't like what happened. I don't trust the other side. Therefore, I'm going to say the election was rigged. Or, even taking the stance of, like, hey, the election, something could have happened with it, is a more mature stance than saying, I am confident the election was illegitimate, right? There's a world of difference there. But I think, our emotions make us more likely to reach for these, like, very certain framings. So, like, I'm certain this is what happened because X, Y, Z. But I don't know if that helps illuminate it. But that's, I just think, getting back to that, it's good to examine the roots of our conflict, and good to bring a little skepticism to our us versus them narratives.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Like, and I tried to say this to people at the time, but like I was like, look, right, after the 2020 election, and it was like, look, like 30-40% of the country of American citizens believe that there's something screwy with that election. Like you, if you want the country to like not be horrendously divided forever, you need to have an investigation. You
Well,
need
you
to
know,
like,
but
or you
let me,
need to
but
do
let me,
something. Yeah,
well, yeah, sure. I mean, I can see the argument. Like, I do believe in like trying to take the other side's concerns seriously. I don't think we do that enough. Like with this imaginary speech I wrote for Biden, it's like I think we need to engage more with the other side's beliefs, even when we think they're, unfounded or even stupid. It's like we do too much denigration or insulting of the other group. So to your point, I think there is some value there, and for example, acknowledging that a majority of Americans, even majority of Democrats in surveys, like supported the idea of voter ID, like requiring ID to vote. So it's like, but some liberals don't want to examine that nuance, or that there might be some things we could do that many people agree with, right? That would set people at ease a little bit more. But to your point too, it's like if we reversed it and like, a lot of Democrats thought that Trump was an illegitimate president, and they would probably balk at suggestions that they needed to do an investigation, just because a large percentage of, I mean, they did do it, but like we should be willing to examine like how we'd feel if the tables were reversed, and be like, well, I can kind of see why they don't want to do it, because we probably wouldn't want to do it in the opposite case, right? So I think it's like, even when we're very much disagreeing and working towards our things, we can kind of see like, hey, if the shoe was on the other foot, I can see how I'd be made angry by what the other side is saying. So to me, it's all just about working towards the things we want to work towards, while like avoiding insulting and being like, you morons, like you traitors for not seeing things as I do, right?
yeah, yeah. And at the very least, please, please, just stop using voting machines. Just count them by hand, man.
Oh yeah,
Just
you're not a fan of those. Yeah.
no. I just think they're rife for things to go wrong, and for people to suspect that things have gone wrong. Like in the UK, we count everything by hand, and do you know what? It's counted by the next day. Yeah, and
Yeah,
in the
do you really
greatest
think
and
it was?
richest country on the planet, I would love to think, you just hire a bunch of people, right?
Yeah, but do you think it would solve it though? Because we have so much us versus them animosity. Then there'd just be accusations of like, were those group of people,
Count,
part of the
do
enemies?
hire
Or,
3 groups of people. You
yeah,
have the fucking money. Like that's
I see what you're saying. I mean, I'm not. I won't debate you on that specific issue. I just think like the root cause of the us versus them animosity, like at some level, no matter what approaches we take, it doesn't appease the us versus them animosity. But not to say you have a good idea. You don't have a good idea there. I've often like skeptical of like even some of the systemic changes, like people talk about, like you know they'll talk about like ranked choice voting or these other things, and I kind of wonder, some of these things, maybe they'll help, maybe they wouldn't, but I kind of see some of them as like, maybe changing something is just going to be another source of animosity, and like more fodder for us versus them. But yeah, it's complicated. It's yeah.
Yeah, that it definitely is. But anyway, Zachary, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been a really, really interesting chat. People go buy his book, Diffusing American Anger. Really enjoyed it. It's available on your website for, yeah.
You can
So
pay as little as $2
choose
for.
your price. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it's kind of a long-winded book, and honestly, you might enjoy checking out my podcast. I sometimes tackle some political stuff in there, but yeah, I really appreciate it, Josh. It was a good talk, and I appreciate you reaching out. Yeah,
Yeah, not a problem, man. Thanks very much.
thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.